2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Tony Zoppi, a young New Jersey lad, enlisted in the U.S. Army. Eventually, he was assigned to Longview, Texas, where he met and married a Longview native. Thus, Tony became a Texan. Tony began his journalism career at the Longview News-Journal. He covered general assignments, sports, and the nightlife, such as there was in Longview. And in 1948, he found himself in Canton, Texas, covering a speech made by senatorial candidate Lyndon Baines Johnson. The story caught Johnson's eye, and Tony accepted an offer to join the Johnson team as an advance publicist. This work led to an offer from the Dallas Morning News, which he accepted in 1950. For the first 2 years there, he was a sports writer. Then he transferred to the amusements department. For nearly 15 years, Tony covered the national entertainment scene, ranging from the Copacabana in New York City to the Coconut Grove in Los Angeles. He became friendly with some of the biggest stars in show business. His column, Dallas After Dark, was a must-read. I believe that was the name of it, Tony. In 1965, Tony accepted an offer from the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas to be director of publicity and advertising. Soon, he was promoted to vice president in charge of entertainment. He booked such stars as Frank Sinatra, Liza Minnelli, Dolly Parton, Dean Martin, Shirley MacLaine, Kenny Rogers, and many others. He returned in Dallas in 1982 to operate his own entertainment booking agency. He says that the most memorable portions of his career involved his coverage of the Kennedy assassination and his friendship with the rather crude owner of a small nightclub who seemed desperate to be like the big-time stars Tony knew, but who was himself hopelessly small-time. His name was Jack Ruby. And now to moderate the panel discussion on events that included Jack Ruby's elevation to national headlines, Tony Zoppi.
Thank you, Darwin. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm amazed at the magnificent job everyone did, especially Darwin, in getting this thing on, because as recently as a week ago, it was really touch and go. We had very few tickets sold, and it was kind of scary, but this turnout has been just great and very heartening. I met Jack Ruby 12 years before the assassination. A friend of mine by the name of Matty Brescia, who was publicist for the old Liberty Network owned by Gordon McClendon, came to my office and said, "You got to meet this guy. He's a real character from Chicago. His name is Jack Ruby." And he was over at Bob Will's ranch house. I think he had a little piece of that place. And we went in. The place probably sat between 800 and 1,000 people, and there were somewhere around 15 or 20 people in the audience. And I was seated at the front row, and he gave me a very flowery introduction. You know, he was always groping for big words, telling how superfluous it was to have Tony Zoppi in the office. And the minute he got through, he jumped off stage and came down to my table and said, "Do you know Cup?" And that was Irv Kupcinet, a legend in journalism in the Chicago area. And of course I knew Cup. We'd been on many trips together. And then he asked me if I knew Dingy and Don Joe and so forth and so on. Well, I found out years later that Dingy and Don Joe owned a very famous nightclub in Chicago called the Chez Paris. And I worked with Dingy Halper at the Riviera Hotel. But he was a name dropper. And as I got to know him through the years, he would come by the office seeking plugs for his various nightclubs. And when he took over the Carousel, which was known as the Sovereign Club before it became this Carousel, he was always asking me for plugs. And one day he walked in, he said, "Let me see your fingernails." I showed him my fingernails. He said, "Look at my fingernails. Aren't they beautiful? Beautiful." I said, "Yeah, mine are very fragile, actually." He said, "I'm going to bring you something to give you beautiful fingernails." And the next day he brought this carton up to the office and dumped it down on my desk, and there was a case full of gelatin. He says, "Put a teaspoonful of that in your coffee every morning, you'll have beautiful fingernails like mine." And I used about 2 spoonfuls of it, and I never used it again. But this was typical. One day he had pizza ovens. The next day he had a skating board. You know, he was always into something. Much has been said about my relationship with Jack Ruby, especially by some of the authors who were trying to prove a conspiracy. One of them in particular, whose book and name I will not use because I don't want anybody buying the book. And he asked me to sue him because I think he was looking for publicity. But he insinuated that Jack, of course, was part of the conspiracy and I was providing an alibi for him. And a lot of it revolved around the fact that I was supposed to go to Cuba with Jack. The reason Jack Ruby was in Cuba is because he stopped me on the street one day on Commerce Street and he says, "How would you like to go to Havana?" And in those days, I was traveling constantly, going all over the country, covering shows. And I'd never been to Havana, so I said, "Yeah, I'd like to go." So he said, "Well, Lou McWillie, who was a gambler here in Dallas in the old days, whom I never met. I don't ever remember meeting Lou McWillie, but I knew him by name." He said, "Lou is head of the casino at the Tropicana in Havana." He said, "I was talking to him, and he wants you to come down and write a story about their show." So I went back to the news, and I talked to Jack Kruger, and Jack was very liberal about me taking trips, as long as it didn't cost the Dallas News anything. They gave me $20 expense money on every trip I ever took, and of course, my hosts in Las Vegas always gave me free room, food, and beverage, so actually, the cost to me was minimal, but I considered it an investment in my career. So I told him I would go to Cuba with him. And we set the date in the early part of December. And in the meantime, I had done a promotion for the Sands Hotel on my television show in which we solicited young girls, Texas girls, who wanted to be chorus girls in Las Vegas. And they were going to audition on my television show, and Jack and Trotter, the president of the Sands, would come down and pick the winners. He selected 14 girls, took them back to Las Vegas, and transformed them into gorgeous chorus girls. So after I had told Ruby I'd go to Havana with him, which was in November, and we set the date for December, and Trotter called me and said, "You got to come out to the Sands. We've got Nat Cole, we got Ronan Martin, who were very good friends of mine, and your Texas Copa girls." So I called Jack and I said, "Listen, I've got to postpone the trip. I want to go out to Vegas and see this show." So he said, "Well, when do you want to go?" I said, "Let's go the first weekend after the first of the year, about the 4th of January. And he says, "Okay." He said, "But I'm going to go on ahead." I said, "Fine, I'll see you down there on the 4th. Well, as we all know, Castro moved in on the 1st of January, and that was the end of that. But he was in Cuba. He had gone down ahead. And Lou McWillie said that he was the biggest pain in the neck. He stayed down there for 10 days, and the fact that I didn't go, he said they refused to pay his plane fare and his hotel room. But he did go back another time. But they're trying to make a connection and insinuated that I was part of the mafia because I was supposed to go to Cuba with Ruby. And this is the way some of these people who write these books have no regard for character or anything that'll make a story. They don't care. And I went on the Geraldo show, if you pardon the expression, simply because this author was going to be on it. When I heard he was going to be on it, I went up there and I cornered him in a dressing room and I told him what I thought of him. And he became even more vicious after that. And he's really done a number on me. But I know who I am, and it doesn't bother me. I kept this panel down numerically because I want to give each of us a little longer to talk. And I'm going to tell one or two Ruby stories. After he shot Oswald, he called me from his jail cell a couple of days afterwards. And I was having lunch at the King's Club, and the manager told me he was on the phone, so I talked to him in generalities for a few minutes. And then I said, Jack, why the hell did you do it? And he started to cry. And he said, I didn't want Jackie to have to come down here and stand trial against that commie rat. And those poor kids left without a father. He said, I was raised without a father, and I know what they're going. And I said, wait a minute, Jack. I said, you can't compare yourself with the Kennedy children. I said, as horrible as this thing was, they're not going to have to scrounge the way you did. And then he really started crying, and he said, I got to tell you something I've never told anyone. And I figured, here it comes. You know, if he was involved in any kind of conspiracy now, he was going to confess to me. Because we were really good friends. And he said, there's an orphanage over in Oak Cliff. And every Christmas I bring every kid in that orphanage. Now, it's a Catholic orphanage, and he's Jewish. And he brought every kid in that orphanage a Christmas present. I don't know how many years, and he even brought presents to the nuns. He said, here it's going to be Christmas in a few weeks, and then nobody's going to get a gift this year, and it really tore him up. And he was crying. And all of a sudden he stopped abruptly, and he says, and I want to prove there was one Jew with guts. I mean, it was such a confusing conversation, I couldn't make head nor tail of it. But this was typical Jack Ruby. He was very hyper. And he had a giggle when he'd come to my office and start to tell a story. He'd start giggling with this shrill giggle. And the people I worked with in the office, after he'd leave, they said, how do you tolerate that guy? And I said, to me, he's a letter from home, because I'm from the Jersey Shore. And I knew a bunch of guys just like him that hung around the pool room. And they were all, they were all cut from the same mold. It's just a type. And he was that type. One quick story about Melvin Belli, who no one has mentioned. I got a phone call from a producer in Hollywood by the name of Gene Mann. And he said, Tony, Mel Belli's coming down there to handle the Jack Ruby case. He said, pick him up at the airport and show him the town. He loves nightclubs. So I met him, and I took him around, and all he did was blast the Dallas News. Every day he would just take the Dallas News apart and the oligarchy. So one day I told him, I said, Mel, you know, if you're going to keep doing this, I can't hang out with you. He said, don't you know why I'm doing this? And I said, no. He said, I want to get this case transferred out of Dallas. He said, I want to change the venue. He said, I'd love to try it in Fort Worth. They haven't convicted anybody there in 100 years. So he tried to change a venue, and it was turned down. But we became very friendly during the course of the trial. And he was an unforgettable character. And I was with Jack's family at the sentencing the day that Judge Brown sentenced him to death. And that was a very traumatic time. And then we decided to go into the King's Club, which was in the Adolphus on the mezzanine, and have a bite of lunch. And as I walked in there, Chris Elson, the owner of the club, said, there's a long-distance call for you. I used to eat there every day, and if you wanted me, you called the King's Club. And I got on the phone, and just as I started to talk, Chris came back into the office, and his lips were trembling. I can see him just as plain as day. And his lips were purple and trembling. He says, they shot the president. I slammed down a receiver and ran back to the news. And Johnny King, the city editor, was more or less directing traffic. And I was a nightclub columnist, which in the journalistic profession is tantamount to a piano player in a house of ill repute. So I turned to Johnny and I said, listen, I'm not a front page reporter, but I am a newspaper man. I said, what can I do? And Johnny said, go out there and maybe you can take in some film from the photographers or something. He said, do whatever you can. But at least I had an assignment. So I got back in my car, and I got out there about a quarter of a mile from the hospital, cars parked all over the place. I pulled into an empty space and ran over to the hospital, and I was at the emergency dock, and the first thing I saw was the limousine with the roses in the back seat and all. And I got up on the emergency dock and started to walk into the emergency entrance, and two Secret Service men said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going in a hospital. See, who are you? I said, I'm Tony Zoppi with the Dallas News. He said, let me see your press pass. Well, I never carried a press pass because, hell, I felt like I didn't need one. I had a daily column and a TV show, and knew everybody around town. They wouldn't let me in. And I was the most frustrated newspaper man in the world, standing out there on that dock, knowing that everybody else was in the hospital. And about that time, an O'Neill ambulance pulled up to the dock and backed in, and the driver and his helper got out and opened the back door, and I saw this huge bronze casket. And up until then, nobody knew for sure whether he was dead or alive. There were rumors that Connolly had been killed or was hurt, and the president wasn't hurt, and then he was hurt, and all kind of conjecture. When I saw that casket, I said, he's dead. And they were trying to lift that casket onto a gurney, and they couldn't lift it. It was so heavy. So the driver turned to me, he says, grab a corner, will you? And I grabbed a corner of the casket, and the fellow next to me grabbed a corner, and we lifted it onto the gurney. And I started to let go, but the Secret Service men, the ones that wouldn't let me in, now they're going, come on, come on, come on. So I just held on. And I figured, boy, I'm going to get in. And I did something that to this day I can't explain. As we're rolling that casket into the hospital, I reached underneath it, and I put my fingerprints as hard as I could on the bottom of that casket. I'm still trying to explain why I did it, other than the fact that I figured, well, he's going to be in this casket, and I want him to know that Tony Zoppi helped carry the casket, and if nothing else, you know. I think that's the closest I can come to explain it. But I got in the hospital. Now, they said, follow the yellow line, which we did right down in the trauma room. And now I could really see the story of the century, you know. And we got right up to the door, and a little Secret Service fellow, about 5'8", I can see him just as plain as day. And he says, we'll take it from here, gentlemen. And I says, oh, no, we got it. And he says, we'll take it from here. And I said, don't press your luck. And I looked over, and there was a bank of phones on the opposite wall. So I went over to one of the phones, and a man answered. And I gave him the number to Dallas News. I said, get me to Dallas News. And he says, get the hell off this line. And the line went dead. The FBI, I learned later, had it tied up all the phones. But there was a stairwell, and down at the bottom of the stairs, I noticed this girl at a switchboard, the old-time plug-in switchboards. And so I ran down there, and I says, I'm Tony Zoppi with the Dallas News. I read your column every morning. I said, do me a favor, get me a phone and get me to Dallas News. She said, go in that office and use that black phone on that desk. So I went in there. She put the call through, and Johnny King, who had sent me out there, rather reluctantly, he answered the phone. I said, Johnny, this is Tony Zoppi. The president is dead, which made me the 2,502nd. So he says, how the hell do you know? Because he had all his top people out there. And I said, I just carried in his casket. And Johnny said, you sure? And I says, I'm positive. Johnny, he's dead. He said, you better be right. And I said, I'm right. Because they were figuring on putting out an extra. And they had to make damn sure, because nobody at the news at that time had heard the confirmation. And I don't want to run over my time because I have a lot of Jack Ruby stories.
That story is to be continued. Yes.
Right.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah.